Welcome everyone to the final part of the Tritium build log. So you can see that I'm draining the loops, and this is because I'm going to change them to glass. I'm going to use Mayhem's 16mm glass. This was actually the plan all along, but there was a couple of different reasons that I wanted to build the loops first in acrylic. First of all, I needed to test the reservoir mod that I did. So I actually split one of the Bitspower hexagon reservoirs in half so that one loop could flow through one half and the other loop through the other half. Now I was confident that this was going to work because I pressure tested it first with air, but I wanted to just let it stand the test of time, so I tested it for a couple of weeks to see if the color would cross over, but that tested fine. But the other thing is, and most importantly, if I'm going to build a glass loop, depending how complex the loop is, I may just go straight into glass, but you can't really prototype with glass because it's a lot more difficult and time consuming to cut and chamfer. So it is easier to just prototype with acrylic first, and you can see what I'm doing here. I'm using the acrylic tubes to get the exact lengths for the glass so that I only have to do the glass once, because often with acrylic you do it a few times until you're happy with the lengths and the bends. Let's take a final look around the build. For the custom paint on this one, I've used two different special effects. DNA Gunmetal Metallic, which is obviously the darker color, and DNA Silver Flare Metallic. So the gunmetal is on the majority of the panels, and I've used two different finishes, different clear coats. DNA Custom Clear, which is the high gloss clear coat, and I've mixed in with this a DNA Silver Flake, quite a fine silver flake. You can see it there on the radiator. It is quite subtle. Then on a few of the panels I've used DNA Matte Clear Coat, and the reason I did this was because I did want the variety in the finishes to make things a little bit more interesting, but also because there are a lot of panels on this case that slot into each other because of the use of the extruded aluminium corners in the design. This top panel actually slides into position, and it's always very difficult to custom paint cases that have panels like that fit down into little slots, because all of the paint just chips off afterwards and things don't really work properly. Even the side panels actually go down into these slots. So I had to be very careful when painting to sand them back a lot first and then not lay on too much thickness. But the use of the matte clear coat, it's one of the hardest paints I have ever used, specifically from DNA. And so it's not just going to chip off when you push the panels into these slots. That's something that I tried to avoid in my design of cases in particular, because I want to be able to custom paint and modify the cases so they're all just bolted together. And you can lay on as much thickness and special effects as you want, and it's not going to, affect the function. But everything worked out quite well, and the panels are a little bit tight here and there, but yeah, no paint is actually chipping off. I mean, you always have to be careful with a nice custom paint job and special effects. It's certainly not as hard as anodizing or powder coat. It's automotive paint. So then we have the DNA Silver Flare Metallic, which also has the matte clear coat, and that is only on the shroud section of the case, the custom panel. The lighting in this build was very important for the theme. Now, I didn't want to add too much lighting because we have so much component lighting already. We have, first of all, the motherboard RGB lighting, and then we have the RGB lighting integrated on the 3 water blocks, the mono block, and the 2 GPU water blocks. And these are just absolutely beautiful water blocks from Bitspower. I love them. We have the integrated flow meter on this one, and the way the lighting is integrated, it just looks great. So you can see there with the GPU water blocks, they have an awesome glow. So I've matched those 3 up with the motherboard lighting. It's all blue. And then we have the lighting on the Corsair Special Edition memory, which is white, and the EVGA SLI bridge, which I've swapped from the Asus RGB SLI bridge because it wasn't syncing up with Asus Aura, which is a common problem. So I didn't want to add any LED strips because that would have just, then the lighting would have crossed over. You would have had the UV lighting flooding the component lighting, and it would have just made all of this look purple. And I managed to fit a dark side UV LED in each of the pump res components. Now at the moment we're shining a lot of light on the build to film it, flooding it so you're not getting the UV effect. But in normal light it does work out really nicely. These dark side UV LEDs work great. So we have 3mm LEDs in the Tritium pump tops and 5mm LEDs in the Bitspower hexagonal reservoirs. So yeah, that's about it for the lighting. Now you can see the cables in this build, well, you just can't really see them. That's the good thing about it. And that's thanks to the cable routing design in this case. It's just very well thought out. But it's also because of the mods that I've done with the shroud. That's why I always love doing cable mods, because you can route them really direct and clean. So the EPS up there, 24-pin, and PCIe. And, that's really all you can see from around here. You can just see the LED cables through there, but considering the amount of LEDs, that worked out fairly clean as well. So let's take a look at the loops. Now this build looks fairly complex at first glance, but then if you take a loop at the loops, they're actually fairly simple and direct. So that's all thanks to the layout, and the complexity of this pump res configuration is really the thing that makes the loops quite simple, the rest of the loops. So coming out of the pump here, we have a large telescopic fitting going straight into the radiator, a 90-degree single and a 45-degree single, then a 90-degree dual, just coming across. And you can see I'm using a lot more fittings now with the glass tube compared to before when I was using acrylic tube, and that's obviously because I didn't bend the glass. There are not many people bending glass. I actually have a guy who's just setting up to do it, and I'm going to start promoting him when he's ready to go, because he's going to have this really cool service where you can build your acrylic tube, cut it, bend it, install it, and test it, and then you can remove it and send it to him, and he will copy it in glass, the bends and all.
So I'm really looking forward to using that because he's kind of specializing in this, and he has the right equipment, he's getting good at it, because it's not the easiest thing in the world. You need to have the right torch, you need to have pressure inside the tube when you're bending it or it's just going to kink. But yeah, definitely a lot more fittings now. So this is Mayhem's 16mm glass tube. We have Bitspower black sparkle fittings, Bitspower hardline compression fittings in 16mm. So over here we have 90-degree female. It's a female fitting, 90-degree single, 20mm extension, 40mm extension coming out of the monoblock, two 90-degree singles, and a 90-degree dual going back into the reservoir over here. Now the fittings in between these components, we have Bitspower mini D-plugs and Bitspower 1-inch D-plugs. For the drainage systems, they're both exactly the same. We have a 90-degree single, 50mm extension, and a large telescopic fitting, then a Bitspower through panel fitting and out the other side. For the GPU loop coming out of the pump, we have a 90-degree single, 90-degree dual, then a mirror image of the configuration at the top, except just with a 40mm extension added. Then coming out of the radiator, a 90-degree single, 90-degree dual, and a 90-degree single and a 25mm extension going into the bottom of the GPUs. And then I have the GPUs in series, which is a little unusual. I usually always put them in parallel. But that was actually one of the challenges with this build. You'll notice that the pump res configuration is slightly closer to the bottom than the top, and that is of course deliberate, specifically for this inlet back into the reservoir here. Now you can see it's actually touching. I designed it to do that just in case of GPU sag to help to prevent it. Although these Bitspower Water-blocks do come with an extra accessory which you can purchase separately, which stops sag. It's actually in behind the SLI bridge there, but there are two black components, nice big billet pieces, which prevent sag. And I do recommend components like this if you have access to them, if you can get them, because a lot of people struggle with GPU sag. So that is why I had to do these in series so that I could come across between the graphics cards. So this is another configuration that you can do that I haven't often done. There are so many ways you can tube up your GPUs. So if I wanted to get back out the bottom, I could have just gone into here and out of here with a parallel configuration. I also could have gone into here and out of here with a parallel configuration. And there are a bunch of others that I could go through in series as well. So, into here, out of here in series, or into here, out of here in series. There's a lot of options with your GPUs. So two 90-degree singles coming across into a 90-degree dual and a 45-degree single. And that is it for the loops. I just have a small extension of 15mm for the fill ports, just to bring them up a little bit to reduce the risk of spillage. I do really like the layout of this case, particularly for the cable management. The position of the power supply seems a little bit unusual and possibly inconvenient because you do have to run the power cable across the top and out the back, but I think that's a very small sacrifice considering the very short and direct routing for the core component cables, and also all of the space that you get down here in this corner. Like down there right now is just completely empty space for cables, splitter PCBs, anything you want, and it's really easy to access the power supply. So if you remove this front panel just by undoing the 4 bolts, you can get full access to all of the connections on the power supply, and to remove it, it just makes it so easy to plug everything in and to route the cables. Now I had to build a new acrylic piece, this acrylic front panel, and I had to do that by hand because it actually broke twice. It broke when the customer had the case before I started the build, and then just randomly during the build. I thought that those acrylic sections were just for aesthetics, for color accents when I first looked at this case, but having pulled it apart, it's actually one of the most important parts of the case for the structure because it stops torsion or twists, from the case moving this way and that way. There are slots, 4 of them in each of these acrylic sections. It's basically a mirror image, front and back, they both do the same thing. And there's a panel here that fits into a slot, the motherboard tray fits into a slot at the top and the bottom, and then there's another one at the bottom. And yeah, that stops the case from just collapsing and falling over to either side. And so it turns out that the majority of the major forces in the case all fall onto the weakest pieces, which are acrylic. So I think that it must be a common problem, but what I did when I rebuilt it by hand is I just drilled a hole at the end of each of the slots. And so what this does, instead of having all of the force going into a 90-degree corner, a very fine point, it distributes the force evenly around a circle, so I don't think it will break again. So you can see the mods that I've done from around the back here. It really seems fairly basic. There were actually 2 covers, and one of them can be reinstalled if the customer wanted to, but I'm not reinstalling it because we have a side panel window on the rear side panel. So that's going to give you full view to the SSDs, the cables, everything back here, which is what I want. But yeah, there's actually a cable cover that fits over this entire area which could still be installed. But just so much room back here. We have plenty of space, for 4 SSDs, the Aquero 6 LT to be able to plug everything into it without any issues. The drainage systems, which I've done differently this time. I used to use quick disconnects in the old days. I haven't for a long time, but I've started using them. They work great on Spectre, and I don't know, it's just something a little different. They are very convenient. You don't have to twist the valve. You don't have this huge valve sticking out. They're quite kind of low profile, and yeah, I just like the way they work. Once you start to push on the tube, then they start to drain. They start to open up. So yeah, they're no spill, so unless you're really careless, you don't get any coolant spilling. But fairly straightforward with the cable routing and cable management. We have a big bundle going across the bottom, which is all of the SATA power. Normally I have to run all of the SATA power off the one cable, which is easy if you have 90-degree SATA power connections, but with this case we don't, they're straight. That then means you normally have to solder if you want to run more than one off the one cable, because you can't just run them straight through the 90-degree connections. And the reason this is a problem is because even on the AX1500i, only have 6 peripheral power connections. And then what about the pumps and the Aquero? But I actually managed to run the pumps and the Aquero off the one cable using 90-degree Molex connections like the one that I have here. So we have Aquabus pumps, which is what that is just there. There's another one of those under that bundle of cables. And this time I used a splitter cable instead of a PCB. And this splitter up here is for the UV LEDs on the pump res configuration. All 5 of them are running off the high amp connection on the motherboard.